Hello everyone, and welcome to the Reading Party podcast with Megan and Lexie. Together, we'll watch, snack, and chat our way through books and films set in the ancient world. We bring our expertise as ancient historians to the table to dissect every detail. We hope you'll grab your favourite beverage and snacks and join us every week on this adventure. Before we start spilling the tea, a brief note on our content. The Reading Party podcast is created for adult audiences. The stories of the ancient world are full of violence and undisguised sexual content, and your hosts aren't afraid to curse up a storm. For those reasons, this podcast is not suitable for under 18s, and certain episodes may not be suitable for those living with trauma. This season, we're focusing on stories set in ancient Egypt, and we'll be bringing in guest hosts that are subject matter experts to help us really dig into the history of what we're reading and watching. With that in mind, let's get going. Lexie and I have our teas and are so ready to start spilling the tea on a ton of ancient stories.
So what tea are you drinking, Megan?
I have spiced orange tea, which is delicious. I realised recently that my only liquid intake over the past month or two has been black breakfast tea. Like literally, I can't remember the last time I just had a glass of water. So I'm trying to branch out. I think I tried this exactly the same point last year. I need to drink other things that are not caffeinated. So we're working our way through herbal teas. And also trying to drink more water because I'm told that's a thing that humans should do to survive. But that's what I'm working with today. What have you got?
I'm boring. I just have green tea, good old green tea. Although this is the fun green tea with lemon in it.
That is not boring. That is delightful and refreshing and very tasty.
It is. It is. No, if I were smart, I would have had some of the tea that you sent me for Christmas, but I just didn't think of it on time. And I was like, oh no, I need something fast. So I had to run and, use the tea bag instead. Darn.
All good. It's all good.
But I have had some of the tea you sent me and it's really delicious.
Is it good?
So
excellent.
Thank you. Yes.
I have the same and I enjoyed it. And I was like, I have to send some to Lexie.
Well, I was going to say, have you tried the mango black I sent?
I have, and it's lovely.
Okay, good.
It's
I was hoping.
Nice. Thank you.
The dirty little secret was that the brand that I love and had for many years, they don't make it anymore. And so this is like the closest second I could find. So I was like, I'm sorry. Really I feel like I'm sending you secondhand tea. But yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed.
No, it's lovely. Thank you.
Yeah. So Desert God, man.
Desert God.
Let's just get right into it.
The fourth or the fifth in the Egyptian series. We skipped Seventh Scroll because I didn't understand it was supposed to be second, but we've done River God, Warlock, and The Quest. So it's the fourth.
Yes.
It's the fourth that we're reading, but the fifth overall.
It's the fourth that we're reading, but the fifth in the series, which makes the timeline really weird because let me just preface this for our audience and say, I've read the whole series before because there's this one, which is the fifth book. And then there is a sixth book that I've also read, but many years ago. I think I read it when it first came out in like 2017 or something. So it's been a while. And I think this book came out in 2014. And I think I read it when it came out as well. Oh my God, it's been a decade. Wow, that's embarrassing. I'm aging myself. Oh God, don't let me do that again, Megan. God, I feel so old suddenly. Anyway, the timeline of the books chronologically, it is the fifth book, but it's second chronologically because it picks up like a few months after the events of River God, which was super jarring because if you read the other books, a ton has happened. You're kind of like confused. Taita's like 116 and all this stuff has happened, but then you're dropped back and he's a eunuch again, even though the last book we read, he was not. And he was uneunuched. And Tamosa, our beloved Prince Mem, is alive. And then, the fun thing I should just say right before you get into your summary, Megan, is that I think, appreciate when I first read it that like one of the sad parts of River God is, that when Lostris and Tanis and everyone are down the cataracts, she has two more children after Prince Memnon. She has Princess Bokatha and what's her name? I don't know why I'm blanking on it right now. That's very funny. But she has the children, and then they're described as like being adorable little girls, but he doesn't really focus on either of them. And so you're kind of like, okay, well, that he cherishes them and raises them like the prince and his mother and blah, blah, blah. But you're kind of like, oh, that's a bit strange that he doesn't focus on the children when he focuses so much on Prince Mem. And that's a huge part of the storyline of River God. So I kind of enjoy how you start this book and then you kind of harken back to that era where like you have the attention on the children again. And then you're like, oh, okay, so we're going to backtrack. And like, I actually get to see how much care and time was spent with the princesses. So it's kind of fun to go back. But before I get further in, I will let Megan take over and give us our standard little summary.
Thank you. So we've made it halfway through. And like Lexie said, this picks up not quite immediately after River God, but pretty soon afterwards. And the Hyksos are still ruling the northern part of Egypt, that is Lower Egypt. And Prince Mem, who is now Pharaoh, is ruling the southern part, that is Upper Egypt. And Taita is doing his usual genius spy master plotting thing. Oh, gosh, it's a lot. What happens is they're trying to seek an alliance with the Minoan king, the king of Crete. But he is currently in an alliance with the Hyksos ruler, which is very bad. So what Taita does is he takes a whole group of Egyptian military men who can all speak fluent Hyksos. Very convolutedly, they go north and then they re-enter the delta on boats. To begin with, they go to this Cretan fortress, they ransack it, they steal all of the money. They're dressed as Hyksos warriors so that the Minoans on guard there think that the Hyksos have double-crossed them and are stealing all their treasury. They leave as many people alive as possible so that they can all the Minoans can sail back to Crete and tell the king that they've been double-crossed. In the meantime, Taita and the rest of the Egyptians put on Cretan Minoan armor, so they look like Minoans, and sail back through Egypt, through northern Egypt, where the Hyksos are. They kill the Hyksosian king and then sail further south back to Upper Egypt with all of the silver that they've stolen from the Cretan fortress. This kind of triggers a military conflict between Crete and the Hyksos, as it would. There's also a succession change with the Hyksos because they killed the king. So they've kind of disrupted the power of balance in that area. The second part of Taita's plan is to marry off one of Mem's sisters, because as Lexie said, there are two lovely sisters, going to marry them off to the Minoan king to kind of solidify alliances and get Egypt some power and hopefully regain the whole of Egypt. So the rest of that half of the book is taken up with a journey of the princesses and all of the people who are necessary for such a journey to Mesopotamia, where there is currently a Cretan ambassador. They're going to meet the ambassador and then hopefully suggest kindly that maybe they should pay a diplomatic visit to Crete, and that would be a great idea, so let's do it. That's the very general, broad stroke description of what's happened. We also have yet another fucking convoluted love story between a royal princess and a common soldier. Really, at this point, the man reuses so many plot points, it's ridiculous. So the Princess Tahunti, who is sister to Mem,
yes. Tahuti,
very royal.
Right, that's her name.
Falls madly in love with a soldier called Zakas, I think. I'm very bad with names. Falls madly in love with him.
Zaras,
there we go. Okay, Zaras. Falls madly in love with him. First bit of the book is taken up with Taita trying to keep them apart. Then he essentially gives up and is like, you know what? Go for it. Just make sure you take your contraceptives because you need to be a virgin when you marry the king of Crete. Spoiler alert, she doesn't do that. So there's then a forced miscarriage, which was, yes, interesting. We'll get to that later. And somehow Tahuti knows about Lostris and Tanis. Lostris told her when she was apparently a child, and she's just kept it a secret. Why Lostris told her? Who the hell knows? But one of the three children knows that they are not actually royal blood. Well, she calls them three little bastards. And she uses that information to essentially not blackmail, but guilt trip Taita into letting her have a relationship with Zaras. We'll get to that whole conversation as well. There's a lot going on here. And through the whole book, or at least through the whole of the half that we've read, we have, again, the over-sexualization of young girls. The opening couple of pages are taken up with several descriptive passages of their lithe, nubile young bodies and their breasts being rosy and pert. And I'm like, oh, just write porn. Just sit down, write a porn novel based in ancient Egypt, get it out of your system, sell it maybe through a different publisher under a pen name. I don't care. Just stop, please. Please stop with the over-sexualization of young children. And again, young children that Taita professes to feel fatherly about. He's not in love with them, as he was with Lustrous, but he's weirdly obsessed with their naked bodies.
But wasn't it weird? Because there was that line in like literally the first couple sentences where he was like, and he glanced over with not a trace of lasciviousness. And I was like, and then you describe them still in a lascivious nature. But like, yeah. Glad to know that your character does not view them with a lascivious eye.
Mm-hmm. It was bizarre. It was very bizarre.
There were some interesting new characters, though, in part one, because I forgot, to be honest, I'd forgotten all about Loxias, the Minoan girl, like merchant's daughter.
Just like a merchant, daughter's merchant, yeah.
Yeah, because there was it his name Alucinius? Oh, God, I can't remember. See, there's so many names, and I read this so fast, but there was basically a Minoan merchant who fled, and Taita befriends him, and he has this daughter, and the rest of their family were horribly tortured and killed, I believe, by the Hyksos pharaohs. So they like fled, and they were like, we're taking refuge. But the kind of adorable fun thing is that the girl apparently is fluent in Minoan. And I was like, well, that's a flex, because none of us can be fluent in linear A or B. And so, of course, Taita's like, teach me.
Sorry, I just have to break in here. He asks her specifically to teach him linear A. Like the Minoans would call their own language linear A. I know that we don't have a different word for it. We just call it linear A. But make something. And a lot of my rants today are going to be about him making shit up. I feel like this is an instance in which it would be perfectly reasonable to make shit up, because an ancient Egyptian is not going to say to a Minoan girl, teach me linear A.
That's like a lot of my criticisms about a lot of stuff, though, because if we want to get into criticism, let's get into the fact that like the whole beginning of the book is this big military campaign, and he's talking about them being on triremes. And I'm like, okay, I'm not the best at dates, but also I was like, let's just assume now, right? So this is after the second intermediate period. Okay, interesting. I get it. Cool. Timelines. I don't remember the exact dates for second intermediate period, but also I do know that it is still in the 1500s. So it's like still, though, clearly in above 1000 BCE. And the Minoans, yes, were there, but timeline wise, I'm like trying to remember. I was like, the Minoans were like roughly dated from like Neolithic starts at like 3000 something and then goes down. But I'm like, the Minoans get sucked into the Mycenaeans by like 1420 or something like that. Just as a classicist, I was like, triremes weren't popularized until at least the 7th century. So like, this is impossible, and it bothers me. And I'm like, at least have biremes, because biremes came before triremes. But even then, I was like, biremes were popularized like kind of, 8th century. So we're trending like back. But also, I'm like, if you look at Greek history, which I'm more familiar with, I'm like, but the Dark Age, quote unquote, I don't know if it's still politically correct to call it the Dark Age, because I know a lot of people don't, but the supposed Dark Age ends in like 1100. So I'm just like, guys, the timelines hurt my brain. There were no triremes. So I think as a classicist, that's my biggest thing, where I'm like, why are we talking about triremes like it's the 5th century? Because this is now way more than 1,000 years off. I'm sorry. The technology does not match. I understand it's historical fantasy, but this is not. Did it bother you or not really?
Oh my God, so much of this book bothered me from an historical standpoint. It's not been much of an issue for me before now apart from a couple of minor points because they haven't really ventured into Mesopotamia much. I know enough Egyptian history to know that this is a little fuzzy in terms of accuracy, but now that we're actually in Mesopotamia and we're about to have a Mesopotamian king as a character, I have notes.
Okay, for me as a classicist, and them introducing Minoans is opening it up for me to really have more to say. But yeah, for you, what is the most egregious thing now that we're like in Mesopotamia that you've come across?
Oh my God. Okay, so before you even get to Mesopotamia, there are things that are just odd. The king is Nimrod, who is not an historical figure. He's biblical. Yes, he's a biblical king of Mesopotamia, but he's not historical. I don't even know that he's based on anyone historical. So that's a problem. His father is King Marduk. Marduk is a god. I think we saw God Marduk in a previous book. He was having babies sacrificed to him. And while it is common in Mesopotamia to have a god name contained within someone's actual name, like Shamash gave a son, Shamash being the god of the sun and of justice, you don't just straight up name your kid Shamash or Marduk. That's the name of a god. You don't do that. Like we had Ishtar being a male, very odd. Ishtar's a goddess. We had Ishtar being a male character in Warlock. So the naming thing is weird and strange. They also keep talking about Sumeria, which is not a thing in any time period. The country or the region is called Sumer. Sumeria is a very dated way of referring to it. And given that this book was published in 2014, there is no excuse. You can Google that shit. So it's not Sumeria, it's Sumer. And it wasn't even Sumer at this point. This late in history, we're looking at Assyria and Babylonia. If anything, we're probably looking at an Akkadian king or a Babylonian king, not a Sumerian king, because that's not a thing at this point in time. Oh my God. Just use Google. Or ask someone or an encyclopedia or literally any kind of research. All that being said, that's all before we get to Mesopotamia. When they finally get there, Taita describes the forested banks of the Euphrates River, which to most people I'm sure won't be at all strange or odd. Lovely trees, fantastic. Mesopotamia is a region famously devoid of trees. It's similar to Egypt in that respect. They had to travel to fucking Lebanon to get enough cedar wood to build temple roofing. You don't have large swathes of forest in Mesopotamia. It does not exist. It did not exist. At no point in history were the banks of the Euphrates heavily forested. No. Bad author. Do even a modicum of research. For the love of God. Thank you. He also refers to Ur of the Chaldees, which is not right. It's just Ur. Ur of the Chaldees is something else entirely. Again, biblical. I think he's getting the vast majority of his understanding of Mesopotamia from the Bible, because then a little bit later he goes on to talk about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which, again, not a thing at all. Known from the Bible, not an actual historical thing. Gardens, yes. Terraced gardens in the palaces, yes. It was annoying. It was really annoying as an Assyriologist, because they're all very basic things. If you're going to write even fantasy, historical fantasy set in a specific historical time period, you need to do this kind of very basic research. Otherwise, do what George R.R. Martin did and take a general concept of like medieval Europe and use that. I suspect even he got a lot more historically correct. And he has fucking dragons. So, yes. No. Come on. Just look. Just look. Okay, please. It's very easy with the internet now. You can do a quick Google search and see, did the Hanging Gardens of Babylon exist? Is Ur of the Chaldees a real place? Is Sumeria even a word? No. No, it's not. The country, the region is called Sumer. Who was in power in Mesopotamia during the Second Intermediate Period? It wasn't the Sumerians. Sorry, I'm going to stop now.
Look, man, I mean, we're going to get to Crete by the end of this, and so I'm sure that my little classics brain is going to combust completely. But yeah, man, to be quite honest, I was really excited to move on to this book because I remembered and I knew on some level, I was like, we're going to get a journey. We're going to go even more into Mesopotamia than we were with the warlock stuff. Because I remember that was kind of cursory. But this, I remember I was like, no, we're going there. We're going to Babylon. We're doing all the things. And yeah, I was like, wow, this is going to be a lot for her Assyriologist brain. Also, the question I had for you, because I don't know. I mean, it sounds kind of wrong to me, and I'm not an Assyriologist, but when they're staying, or if I understood everything correctly, they were staying in the ziggurat, like a hotel? Did people stay in ziggurats?
To be the case. No, there were quarters for the priests and the priestesses, but no, people didn't, because that's the god's house, right? The temples are the houses of the deities, and they were heavily, or at least the interiors were heavily, not policed, but restricted. They had very restricted entry. There were living quarters for the priests and the priestesses, but no, you wouldn't just get random visiting dignitaries staying there. If anything, I assume they'd be housed at the local palace or with local officials, like they'd be staying with the ambassador, not in the temple complex. It was an interesting choice.
I was going to say, do you think he chose them to stay in the ziggurat just because it's like the biggest, most recognizable building? And so he thought maybe like people would understand, or like that he thought that the building itself would convey this sense of importance because it's huge?
I mean, maybe. I honestly don't know where 98% of this is coming from. I don't know why you'd have people staying at the temple. Like, there's a perfectly good ambassador there. Surely he has guest rooms. Choosing the temple just seems very strange. I don't understand why a lot of it was included. Very odd.
The whole thing is odd.
Oh, and did you know that Taita invented the concept of an engagement ring with a diamond?
Yes, but apparently he also invented the concept of minting coins.
Yep, that was a good one. He just keeps coming up with these amazing ideas.
I just thought it was really funny. I mean, you have this really funny conversation with Tamosa, but I just call him Mem because he's still just Prince Mem to me. But yeah, it's really funny. He starts off like a little strumpet when he's like, wait, you're telling me I'm very rich and I can't use any of my money? And then he's just like, no. He's like, you can use it. You just got to change it. And he's like, oh, okay. So what do we do? And he's like, well, I would suggest minting it. And then when we mint it, I'm going to invent the word coin. And then let's call your coins mems. And then he's like, we have to put an image on it. And I think we should do this. And he's like, other barbaric places did not use coins until later. And that was thanks to me. And I was like, oh, dear gods, please stop. I mean, Taita is vain. We know this. He's very pompous and he's very vain. That's what makes him a bit endearing, because you're like, oh my God, you are so pompous. So like, it tracks. It was very on brand for Taita. Like, it just made me giggle because I'm like, oh, he's back. The sassy Taita from River God is
the
back.
Taita we know and love.
Exactly. I mean, this is the Taita who's like Taita and Lustrous forever.
And he invented the lock system for moving water up and down in canals.
Yeah.
Because of course he did.
Because of course he did. So it's interesting because I'm like, when you're looking at the narrative of the book, some things that I was very interested by were they made a big deal about how Memnon had the blue sword from Tanis, but also he got the blue sword because he wanted, what's her name? The princess from the Shilluk, or no, where were they? Somewhere in Nubia. And they got married and were like happy. And if this picks up a few months, I'm like, where is she? Because they talk about the harem.
Yeah. They
talk about a lot of other things. But he turned it into like an epic love story with, oh my God, I can't remember her name at this point. I think it's with an M. Fuck. This is embarrassing, but also it's been a very long time and we've read a lot of things. So my brain is full. But the princess who he had to go rescue and was like deeply, deeply in love with. If this is a few months, I don't know why she's not there. With Warlock, we had the time jump where he was about to die. And I remember being like, I don't know why she's not there, but okay, maybe. Well, he said that there was some plague that like killed off a lot of people. And so I think we just chalked her being gone up to like being a casualty of the plague that killed out most of his family. But I was very confused.
She's mentioned once right toward the end of the first half. well, not quite at the end, but during the first half, she's mentioned once when Tahuti is trying to persuade Taita to let her have an affair with Zaras, because she says that Mem and Princess, her name does begin with an M, and I'm completely blanking. Also, they have this like great love story, and none of the women in the harem ever see Mem once they're married.
Was it Mary Cara?
Yeah, maybe.
I feel like it was like Mary Cara.
Yeah, that's the only time she's mentioned. And that whole conversation was bizarre and clearly written by a man, because Tahuti is essentially saying all of these women are so sexually frustrated. They have ivory and silver dildos, and they have sexual relationships with other women in the harem because they're so upset and frustrated that they can't have sex with Mem, who is apparently all of their one true love. And she doesn't want that fate for herself, or at least if she has to have that fate and be married into a royal harem, let her have sex with a man that she does actually love before she's consigned to this life of forced lesbianism. It was weird. It was really weird and very, well, I've used the word weird twice, but honestly, it's the only word I have for it. It was bizarre. Absolutely bizarre to make the argument that all of the women in the harem are desperately in love with Mem, who, if we're going by generally how harems are portrayed and how I suspect they probably worked, you marry someone to solidify an alliance, and then you maybe have sex with her a couple of times, but, you know, you have other responsibilities. You have other women in the harem who also need sex a couple of times, and you have a whole-ass wife, at least one. So it would not be unusual to be married into a harem and then not really see your husband and just kind of enjoy your days not having to work and listening to music and talking with friends and, okay, maybe having an affair with one of the other wives because, hey, why the hell not? I don't understand why or how this is being portrayed as such a horrible thing. I mean, not saying that I would enjoy being in a harem, but it was very strange, and the whole thing just screamed, this is written by a man who doesn't understand.
The whole thing is very bizarre. I had a lot of questions.
Did you catch, by the way, that Lustrous was apparently a blonde?
Yes, but I knew that.
I completely glossed over that in River God.
Oh, yeah, no, because they talk about it being a very strange match because she had these, like, penetrating green eyes that were very striking, and she had this very wonderful head of blonde hair, and then Tanis was also an outlier redhead. Because as an Egyptian, he was a redhead, and they were like, what? So I was like, okay.
The thing is, when they're talking about it in Desert God, it comes up because the military company that Taita leads right in the beginning to the Cretan fort, he makes an effort to just choose blonde or fair people. It just felt strange.
Yeah.
Sorry. I wasn't going anywhere with that. It was just something that tripped me while I was reading.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I had many questions. I wish I could have asked, or could ask, right, Wilbur Smith, like, why this decision or why that decision? Okay, you know what? I've also decided we've spent a lot of time criticizing. And is there anything that you did enjoy about this book, just so it's not all doom and gloom for any potential readers?
I mean, it's an easy read. It's a so far non-offensive plot. We've come across no sexual assault as of yet. It's Wilbur Smith, and we're still only in the first half of the book, so there is plenty of room for some kind of rape to happen. I think Tahuti is a fun character. I think she's sweet and silly, and I enjoy the ways that she tries to circumvent the authority figures in her life. Taita is irritating. He's always been irritating to me, so that's not terribly new or different. For all that I've been complaining, it's a fun read. It doesn't require an awful lot in the way of brain power. So if you just want something easy with a bit of adventure and some romance in, that happens to be set in a version of ancient Egypt, then this is probably a good one to go with. How about you?
Again, he has a beautiful writing style, and it's very immersive. I will say that. So I guess the same as the others, which is like, content aside, if you like something that I do find beautifully written, this is beautifully written. It's very descriptive. If you kind of like the immersive feel, it's there. Look, if you don't have a historian brain and you want to just kind of sink into something where if you have kind of a knowledge of like ancient history elements, but it doesn't bother you and you just don't, you either don't know or you don't care, like the trireme thing won't bother you. And if you don't know anything about Mesopotamia, but you're like, I mean, I know some famous king names. If I wasn't a historian, I would say I would see it as just kind of a fun historical fantasy adventure. And I probably would enjoy most of it. Like, it's silly, it's fun if you can get past Taita just being like a big airhead who's very pompous and you just kind of have fun with it. It's a fun read. Because I'm thinking about like when I first read it and I didn't know as much about anything. You know, I was just a sophomore and I didn't really know classics that well. So I'm trying to think like, why did I love it or like it so much? And I think it was just because I found it entertaining and immersive. And like if I just wanted to lose myself in a grand adventure, kind of traveling around the ancient world, like this was it. This was my jam. So I think that's the space that I would say you need to be in.
I would agree with all of that. I know I'm very critical of Wilbur Smith's writing, and there are two things really that I have deep issues with. Those are the misogynistic and the racist overtones. Even if I was reading it as an historiologist, I can look past inaccurate historical details, right? Because he's creating an imaginary idea of Mesopotamia, and he's using things that your average reader will be familiar with. They're going to be familiar probably with Nimrod. There's a tower that is described as being like a huge round tower that sounds like it's straight out of that old painting of the Tower of Babel. People are going to be familiar with this. So he's creating this atmosphere to show that you're not in Egypt anymore and you're in this foreign land, and this is kind of the feeling that you're going for. Fine. It's irritating, but for me, it is mildly irritating at worst. I am latching onto it so strongly because I am very prejudiced against Wilbur Smith as a writer already, because of what we've previously read and previously discussed, and because he keeps explicitly, overtly sexualizing all of the women in the book, like all of them. They're either horribly ugly or they're deeply attractive, and it's very uncomfortable to read. And then you add the other layer of how he has described Nubian people and other African civilizations in the other books. It's racist and it's misogynistic, and no, it's not like the overriding theme of the entire book, but it bothers me enough that I'm being less charitable, I think, than I would be were those things not there, right? Because I do appreciate what he's doing with the threads that he's pulling from other cultures. Do I wish it was a little bit researched? I can't even say better research because I don't think it was researched at all. Yeah, it would be nice to have a little bit of research, but it's not like a deal breaker for me, really.
I think we're also super sensitive to it because we're reading the whole series. And so there is going to be that toll, that effect of like you read enough misogynistic, racist, colonialist stuff back to back to back. We were just like, God, like it started bad. And if it was just one book, then you'd be like, okay, that's hard and I don't like it. So like I will tell people this is in there, but like, okay, it's fine. Just be aware. But like 5 books in and you're using the same strong language, there's no tempering of it. And it's 2014 by this point, and you're like, really? So I think there's just that toll. Because I read these so spaced out that I remember thinking like to myself, like, yeah, this is some terrible language, but I think when I originally read it, I had the mindset of like, it was spaced out enough that like, I didn't like it, but it wasn't super overwhelming. We're probably never going to read these again, but I was kind of like, I don't know if you ever did come back to it. I think like you'd be bothered, but not in the same way.
Probably not. And I think honestly, after River God, if I was left to my own devices, I probably wouldn't choose to read the rest of them. So reading all of them, having been maybe triggered is a bit too strong of a word, but having had a strong reaction to this stuff in River God and just having to like keep slogging through it. Each time it pops up, I'm like, oh, fucking hell, really? Again? Come on. Evolve a little bit. Change your thinking. Yeah, so I don't know. I want to ask, and I know it's been a while, are there any parts of the Crete journey that you are particularly looking forward to revisiting?
I'm trying to remember. So I generally, I think, liked the description of the fact that the supreme Minos is described as like having the bull helmet, right? And he's shrouded in mystery, but he's known to have like this amazing sexual appetite for women and blah, blah, blah. I seem to remember him being Oh God, I wish I remembered more, but like I don't remember if he was funny. I don't want to spoil the end of the book, so I won't actually say what I'm thinking, because I was going to say what I do remember, I think, is the ending, and I don't want to spoil it for anyone who is maybe reading this, but also for you, Megan. But I don't remember exactly how it's done, but we meet Minos, and he's a character.
I have been intrigued by what's going to happen with him, because he's kind of built up a bit in the first book. The Minoan guy who is the father of Loxus, I don't remember.
Oh yeah,
talks
Loxus.
It talks about how the Supreme Minos is immortal and wears this massive bull helmet and has 100 wives, and every time all of his subject kings each sent him a daughter as a wife every year. And Taita's like, if all of them sent him a daughter for a wife every year, how does he only have 100 wives? And the guy's like, I don't know. This is just what I was told. So it's, going to be interesting to see what he's actually like. And I want to see the Temple of Ishtar, because the Egyptian ambassador has been hinting very heavily he said that he will take Taita there and that there's going to be a ritual that he will find interesting. And given it's Ishtar and she is the goddess of love and sex, and there are some wild things circulating about what rituals to Ishtar actually entailed, I'm going to be very interested to see what that actually is.
If I remember correctly, and now I'm just speculating because I really don't remember actually, so we'll have to wait and see. But if I remember, I think when they get to Babylon, I seem to remember something about like Taita actually being impressed, and this is like the first time where he's just like, the Egyptian characterizations like don't do justice or something to it, because I just remember him being like, wow, Babylon is gorgeous. I don't remember exactly what he had something happening there though, where it was like they were either poor or there was the result of war. There was something though where he was like equal parts shocked.
Yeah, so because King Nimrod's father, King Marduk, he spent all of the country's money on building this tower. The idea behind the tower is apparently that he was going to build it all the way up to heaven to persuade the goddess Ishtar to come down and to marry him and be his wife, which was a really interesting interpretation. And see, this is where the reception bit actually is interesting for me, because it's an interpretation of later understandings of what's called the sacred marriage rite. And we don't actually know if this happened. Historically, there are some texts. It's a little bit ambiguous. But the idea was that the king would sleep with the high priestess of Ishtar once a year as like a fertility and not productiveness, but prosperity of the kingdom thing. So I think what Wilbur Smith is doing is taking that idea of the sacred marriage rite and making it into, this crazy king wanted the goddess to actually come and marry him and live with him on earth. But Marduk spent everyone's money building this tower, didn't finish it, then died. So Nimrod has inherited essentially an impoverished kingdom, which is horribly shocking to Taita, because everybody else is under the impression that the Mesopotamian kingdoms are horribly wealthy and can afford to fund their military activities.
Yeah, that basically. Well, and then I know that he's toned down the magics from the quest and stuff, but I seem to remember that he still has like weird visions and visitations and other things of Ishtar. But also I think I did remember, and now comparing it to, because again, I don't think I would have realized if I hadn't been doing this with an Assyriologist who can tell me. But yeah, like the Sumerians would have been long gone by this period in history. But I seem to have some memory of whenever she presents herself to him, she always uses her Sumerian name. So she's always Inanna.
Interesting.
And I just remember thinking like, oh, that's interesting. Like, why would she want to be Inanna here when I feel like more people might be familiar with the name Ishtar, but I don't know that for certain. I cannot say one way or the other. But yeah, so I have these vague memories of like, she comes to him either in some sort of dream or something, and she's like, I'm Inanna, and she's like, you are my chosen, you are my, I'm going to borrow from the Mummy movie now, my Seti Pai, my chosen one. And so there was that whole thing. I don't remember if that actually changes the plot in any way, but I'm just like, I know And I remembered somewhere in the series that she comes to him and is like, you are my chosen for some reason.
Oh, that's going to be fun.
Yeah. So there's that. And then I think, just my supposition for the second half, I think we're going to learn more about the Greek pantheon of gods, but they don't really bring in the gods that we know. If I remember correctly, he does kind of tee it up where he has the Minoans worshiping the Titans. So I think we're going to hear a lot about Kronos, which is going to be really interesting because we're very familiar with the myth of Kronos. So I don't remember what he does with it, but I think that when we get to Crete, we're going to hear more about Greek religion, and I'm going to cringe probably. It's going to be a wild ride. But I'm actually really happy that we're getting to something that I'm more familiar with in history, which is funny.
I am enjoying this, I think, more than I did Warlock or The Quest. I enjoy a good fantasy novel, but once we start getting into the realm of Taita being superhero-esque, immortal magic dude, it doesn't feel... It's just, I don't find it as enjoyable.
I don't know if I don't like it because he's like the souped up magus. I think it's more like, I like my historical fantasy when, okay, like you can have fantastical elements, but please ground it in some kind of period or location or something that I am familiar with that I can still find enjoyment. I mean, when you're wandering the desert and have characters now doing things that you're like, okay, why should I care about this person? Who is this? You know, I get a little lost, a little bored, but we're firmly back into the realm of like, these are characters that we're familiar with from the first book, or even if they weren't old enough to like interact with, you still know them, like the princesses. Like they were pretty young, so you didn't really get to know them, but like you know who they are, and then you're supposed to have this sort of connection with them because you're like, okay, so these are Loster Centanus' kids. Like this is, you know, Tomosa we're talking about, so we know Mem. And then even bringing back and having characters like Kratos, and we have Hui again, Master of Horse, and Renrem. You know these guys, and Aton, the funny servant to Pharaoh Mimosa. So I think there's the comfort of like, we have the characters back, but then when you ground it in like, you know, I'm not really familiar with Mesopotamian history, but like, it's kind of fun. Like I know some things about it, so it's fun to explore, but then we're going to Crete. So I'm like, okay, there's like actual tangible excitement because that starts the period of history that I am much more familiar with. And I think there's just a level of excitement there. I do love Egypt, but I'm ready to expand beyond, especially since we're in book 5 of a series where I'm like, I want beyond and beyond somewhere interesting that's not just like the wandering desert. And this kind of satisfies it. Yeah, honestly, my biggest complaint about this, just as a book fan now and not even just a history fan, like if we're forgetting the history part, it seems that the lore is a little mixed up. I feel like I want a lore master, because if I'm thinking back to like, okay, I read Warlock second because that's the second book that came out. The names of the pharaohs are completely different. Like in the first book, in River God, they're like, okay, so Letis is the king. And then you have his son and successor, who apparently is here when we see him slayed. But also, if you go to Warlock, like it's a completely different ruling family. They're doing stuff. So you're kind of like, where's the connection? And then I just remember thinking like the lore is getting messed up because like at this point, am I supposed to believe that Mem does not have a son and his son will become our titular hero from Warlock? Which, okay, makes sense. But also Mem died pretty young because he was slain, which would suggest that chronologically that Warlock happens after this whole book because he's pretty young here. But then based on just solely on the synopsis of the last book, and from what I remember, the synopsis of that whole book was that Tomosa was dying of old age, and then his son was Uteric, and then he also has a son named Ramesses. And I was like, well, that does not go in any way with the lore of this book or Warlock. So I was like, I think he needs help. He needs like a lore master. Bring in a lore master, because he's kind of rewriting and resetting history. And I just, from what I remember, I'm like, this is where the waters start getting a bit muddy. So just, you know, if I'm a fan of the series from a pure series perspective, this would be akin to like, if you're a fan of Percy Jackson and you're like, okay, and so now Annabeth and Percy are dating, and then psych, like Annabeth is dead the next moment, and you're like, wait, what? So it's just it's really jarring. So that's my one complaint from a lore perspective, and it's to the surprise of no one. I am a very big lore person, whether that's in films, TV shows, games especially, but also books. So if I cared more, maybe I'd see it as a big betrayal, like, oh no, what if George R. Martin or Tolkien did something? But I'm not that invested. So I'm like, okay, it just makes it hard to fit things in chronologically and put a picture of the timeline together. But other than that, I'm like, okay, the lore is wonky, but I don't care enough to really try to put it back together. I don't know. Are you spotting lore issues as like a general reader or no?
No, I'm not. If it was like a major character thing, like if he changed something drastic about Taita, I'd probably be like, that's off. Like if suddenly he's not a eunuch in in the quest, but if suddenly like it just wasn't a thing at the beginning of a book with no explanation, then I think that would trip me up. But no, that kind of more minor detail doesn't necessarily stick with me. But either needs a lore master or a very good spreadsheet.
One of the two. All I know is it's just weird because we go back in time for both this book and the last one, and all I know is like he made this big deal about Nefer being the chosen son, and then if I remember correctly, it's like in the next book there are two sons who fight to be pharaoh, who apparently Nefer is not born or in the picture or mentioned ever, and Pharaoh is dying of old age and not killed by an arrow. So
that's a little messy.
I think he was trying to like do a hard reset. I honestly think he wrote River God, then he was like, okay, Warlock will be my big sequel. And then when he was like, okay, I want to continue, I think he had it in his mind and he was like, okay, well, I already did all this stuff and Taita's old. So then he was like, okay, I'll just write him as a 116-year-old, whatever, going off in the desert and being whole and then being with the dead spirit of Lostress. And I think it just writes like he intended to end the series there. It's not a true prequel because it's not before River God, but it's like a prequel to Warlock with the last two. But because the newest two books, I think it throws off. And then you're kind of like, well, then if you're trying to write like a whole new story, sequels to River God proper, but prequels to Warlock, like it gets really messy. The last two books definitely feel like we're firmly in the territory where it feels like he's trying to do a hard reset, but like is trying to also then pretend that like Warlock and the Quest and maybe Seventh Scroll, which also happens in like 19th century or whatever. Like it just feels like those he's trying to like forget it. I don't know what he's trying to do. It's very confusing. So I have a lot of questions both about the book, the direction, from just a fan perspective. That's not even the history. So I think my moratorium on this book is if you kind of forget that the other books exist and take it as a pure sequel to River God, you might enjoy it. And I do find it's beautifully written, but other than that, I don't know. Any final thoughts for you?
I think that I agree. You should definitely take it. Like if you're coming to the series new and you haven't been reading along with us, I do River God, then I do this one. Like read them in actual chronological order. I think it's going to make a hell of a lot more sense because when I started this, it took me a few pages to kind of reorient myself. The writing is still excellent. He is a very descriptive author. He has a great way of drawing both characters, much as I dislike some of them, and landscape. I think the one caveat with that is that we still do have a very black and white good guys versus bad guys system. It's been that way in all of them. I'm not anticipating it changing anytime soon. So if you like a bit more complexity in your characters, you're probably not going to find it here, to be very honest. But it's a fun read. I am enjoying the bits of it that don't involve talking about breasts, which is thankfully quite a lot of the book. The breasts only turn up a few times. So that's good. I'm really interested to see where it goes in the Ishtar Temple and then what happens when we get to Crete.
Yeah. I think that's as much excitement as I can drum up. I feel bad. I'm like, I wish I had something more positive to say. Like, I always feel like this might have just been a really bad decision for us to do almost all the books of this series in the same season. It's a lot because I didn't realize how depressing it would kind of turn out to be. But yeah, okay, well, I wish I had something more fun to say, but I don't. So that's what we think of part 1. Join us next week for part 2. Hopefully we'll have more to say maybe about the history. We'll see. It might just go into Crete and then be completely terrible and I might have more complaints. I don't know. Anyway, that's what we think. Yeah, we'll see y'all next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey, thanks for listening. Don't forget to leave us a review, and you can also follow us on social media at The Reading Party Podcast. If you'd like to leave us a book or movie suggestion, then email us at thereadingpartypod@gmail.com. See you next week.